Dante wrote, "The path to paradise begins in hell." Join Deacon Don Prendergast and David Fortin as they discuss the tools men need to build the domestic church and the spiritual weapons to defend it. This is Through the Fire.
And Deacon, we are back from our break.
We are back.
That was a particularly long break for us.
Yes. Well, people don't know that we've been talking for like the last hour in between the break.
The magic of radio.
Man, yes. We're able to pause time. But yeah, we kept talking during the break.
Yeah. Stephen Hawking wouldn't understand that. The way time works in that break. Yeah.
But we were functioning actually on God's time. We're functioning on the eternal now.
Imagine that. Deacon, we're going to continue our conversation about sacrifice.
Yeah, so we were talking earlier about sacrifice through Christ and how there is a relationship between when we sacrifice, we're participating in our own salvation. I mean, our redemption, the suffering becomes redemptive suffering when we join it to the cross of Christ, when we join it to his suffering. But that's not exactly how our culture has its attitude when it comes to suffering, does it?
No, it's not.
No, most people have the attitude of what's in it for me.
Always.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. We will sacrifice today for something better tomorrow. And that's not a Christian way of looking at things, is it?
I mean, on the one hand, it is good for us to delay gratification. Because, the society today, it's so impulsive. People don't even want to sacrifice for a day. It's like, I want to start at the finish line. And that's just not reality from a practical perspective. We just know that. Anybody that's kind of lived, they realize that, first of all, if everything is handed to you, you're not going to appreciate it. If you're not working for what you've earned, if you're not earning for what you have, if you're not working towards an end, that is a meritorious end that's going to bring you to a place that's better tomorrow than where you are today. If you're not working towards that, then you're not going to appreciate it. I mean, we just know that. We know that anecdotally. That's just the way that it is. It's important for us to sacrifice, to delay gratification. It's important for us to see the future benefit in relationship to today's sacrifice so that our sacrifice today has meaning and purpose. It's kind of like, when we look at our children. Think of it this way. You look at a baby. Do you see the productivity of the baby? No, you don't see that. The baby is the baby. There's very little expectation. But what many loving parents will do is they look at their child and they see the potential and they dream and they imagine what could be. And very instinctually, parents will then sacrifice for themselves. I mean, on a very practical basis, just look at motherhood in a very practical, ordinary way. Mothers sacrifice constantly for their children. My wife has told me many times when the kids were young, my wife has gone years without eating a warm dinner because they want to make sure the babies are taken care of, the kids are taken care of, and so, my wife would comment to me and she would say, it's just motherhood. You kind of get used to eating a cold dinner. Or as you're cooking, you're picking. And so when it comes time to serve the food, you're really not eating because you picked while you were cooking. And these are the sacrifices. Another good example is, and I'm sure a lot of women will relate to this. My wife has commented that Thanksgiving, right? So Thanksgiving, she'll spend hours shopping, planning, meal prep, cooking, and then the food goes on the table. And how long are people sitting there actually eating? You have hours of preparation for 30, 45 minutes of dinner time. So, I mean, there's all kinds of very ordinary ways that we sacrifice, and we look at that. And it's understandable that, there's all kinds of sacrifice. As dads, how many of us dads sacrifice, push our bodies to the limit so that we can adequately provide for our families. It's just the reality of ordinary living. But now Jesus is telling us we need to look bigger than that. On the ordinary, and it's good for us to look at sacrifice on the ordinary. But it's also important for us, and the church teaches this, it's important for us to recognize that the domestic church is meant to be a reflection of the eternal church. The domestic church is meant to be a reflection of Mother Church. The domestic church is meant to be a reflection. The family inside of that is supposed to be a reflection of the Holy Family, of the eternal family, of, the domestic church is supposed to be a foreshadowing of the wedding feast and the groom, the bridegroom, the groom being Jesus, and how all of us are the bride. And so what we do in our domestic church is meant to, it's very deliberately, God established the human family to be a foreshadowing of what is to come. When we enter the great wedding feast where Jesus is the groom and all of us are the bride, we live that out on an ordinary basis in our homes. And so the sacrifice that we experience in our homes are meant to be a preparation and an entrance way, and it's meant to be a guide for the eternal teaching of the sacrifice of Jesus. Some people may be listening to this and it's like, I don't know. I don't get it. Dave, I want to introduce everybody to, some of you already know this, but I want to introduce you to another writing from John Paul II. And this one is Fides et Ratio, which is on the relationship between faith and reason. And so this is an important encyclical for us to reference, because this is on faith and reason and how the two are not in competition for each other. And let me just read a paragraph, and then we'll go back and we'll talk a little bit more about our culture and about the act of sacrifice and how we should be thinking about it. And so John Paul II, he writes, Thomas recognized, and he's talking about St. Thomas Aquinas, Thomas recognized that nature, philosophy's proper concern, could contribute to the understanding of divine revelation. Faith, therefore, has no fear of reason, but seeks it out and has trust in it. Just as grace builds on nature and brings it to fulfillment, so faith builds upon and perfects reason. Illumined by faith, reason is set free from the fragility and limitations deriving from the disobedience of sin and finds the strength required to rise to the knowledge of the triune God, although he made much of the supernatural character of faith. The angelic doctor did not overlook the importance of its reasonableness. Indeed, he was able to plumb the depths and explain the meaning of this reasonableness. So when we listen to this teaching, St. Thomas Aquinas, he's one of the greatest, if not the greatest, theologian of the church. And everybody uses him because he really tears apart every question and looks at it from every angle. And so really the idea about faith and reason, they're not in competition with each other. And faith seeks out reason. Does this make sense? If we boil it down to an ordinary basis, does it make sense? Does our sacrifice, does our delayed gratification, does our sufferings, does our postponement of what's good for me today physically, by pushing that out into the future, by sacrificing, will that be good for my soul? And the answer is yes. But we live in a society that doesn't think that way. So some of you may be aware that I'm back in school getting a graduate degree in mental health counseling. And one of the things that's really interesting, we were talking amongst my fellow students about this therapeutic counseling tool, and it's called the miracle question. And the idea is, with the miracle question, if somebody is just not satisfied with their life or depressed or what have you. If you were to ask that person, so let's say you go to sleep tonight and you wake up in the morning and everything in your life, every aspect of your life is exactly as you would like it to be, what would that look like? Describe it. Let's get into detail. What would that look like? And then in the process, you would start to identify all the different attributes as to what the person would say. Well, I'd like my relationship with my family to be this. I'd like my employment to be that. I'd like to do this, whatever it may be. And then part of that therapeutic process would be, okay, well, let's dissect this and start taking a look at what would need to happen in order to get there. So looking at that, we could also ask ourselves from the perspective of sacrifice, if you can have that ideal situation 5 years from now, what sacrifices would you need to make today in order to achieve that? Likewise, if we take a look from a spiritual perspective, from a relationship with Christ perspective, do you want to end up in heaven? Do you want to be with Jesus for eternity? Because the reality is, and I think it was Father Larry Richards that brought this out, the reality is when we die, Jesus is going to give us exactly what we want. The question is, will it be him? And so if we want him, because he's going to give us what our heart's desire is, the question is, will it be him? If that's the case, then we need to take a look at, just like with the miracle question, just like with the idea of, what would you like to happen in 5 years? We have to take a look at, from a life of virtue versus vice, how do we have to live so that when the day comes that we pass through the doorway of death from this life to life eternal, and we face our particular judgment, Jesus will be able to see very clearly, okay, so it's me that you desire. You got it. You get me. You get everything that comes as being part of me. That's the big question. That's sacrifice. It seems to be so easy that we can sacrifice for a job, or I'm going to go to school for 4 years and get my degree. I'll sacrifice. I'll pay my way through school by getting a second job. I mean, it's fine, but let's face it, sometimes that could be a little selfish.
Deacon, I want to go back just for a minute to when you were talking about children. Now, there is an expectation that the sacrifice that we will do as fathers, as parents, there is that expectation that is going to be returned to us by our children. When we become elderly, our children will take care of us the same way we took care of them.
Uh-huh.
But there are those children that expectation does not exist. And that is truly sacrifice, because you know that what they give is love in the present. They're not going to be able to take care of their elderly parents.
Right.
With that expectation.
So with regards to that, you kind of have to ask a different question. With regards to what you're describing. So what about the future potential of someone who is severely disabled, right, the future potential of someone who is terminally ill from birth?
Right.
We have to be very, very careful not to look at that narrowly. See, every life changes the world. Right. Every life changes the world. And every child is a gift from God. As parents, we have the responsibility to care for this gift.
Mm-hmm.
It would be dangerous to say that this child is our property, belongs to us in a material sense.
Right.
It would be dangerous for us to have that kind of attitude.
Right.
So when we think about our children, even if our children are particularly difficult, whether it's behaviorally, medically, whatever the circumstances are, even if it appears to be a hardship, it's still important for us to realize that every life impacts the world. The question is, how are we going to approach that? So, for example, if there's a parent who is struggling because they have a child that is behaving very disobediently. While it's important for us to recognize the virtue of patience, it's important for us to recognize that each one of us are called to live by faith. Each one of us are called to raise up our children, as it says in Deuteronomy, whether you're at home or abroad, you train your children up in the faith. So what happens if that's not a very practical thing that you're able to do? This goes back to understanding suffering.
That's where
it goes back to understanding suffering. Yeah. Because maybe it would be wrong for us to assume that we understand God because God's ways are not our ways. But maybe God is asking us as parents to suffer. That's what he's doing.
And the reason I asked that question was because suffering has got to lead to trust.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
And I think that by having a child with Down syndrome or autism or something like that.
A child that is defiant, a child that is bipolar, a child that has oppositional defiance disorders, or a child that is severely depressed, whatever the issue might be, still, you have to realize that there's more to the relationship than just the child.
Right.
There's the child who has to, in many regards, live their own life, experience their own life. But then there's the life of those who are around that child, the parents who have to make additional hardships and sufferings, the parents that have to make additional sacrifices, the comfort, and the softening of the heart that God, if allowed, will bring upon those parents, knowing that they are suffering. I mean, a perfect example is look at the Blessed Mother.
Right.
The Blessed Mother was there watching her son, who she knows is innocent, watching him be brutally tortured, mocked and spit upon, and then ultimately executed on the cross. So whether the hardship and the sadness comes through medical illness, circumstances like a house fire or war or whatever, or just simply the brutality of the world. As a parent, we enter into that with our children also. We suffer with our children. And so it still comes back to the attitude that we're going to have and how we're going to enter into that suffering. And are we going to call out for the grace that we will need so that we could enter into that suffering and remain connected in trust and faith and obedience to God?
Is there ever a situation that's hopeful but hopeless?
Every situation.
Yeah.
I mean, really, every situation. It goes back to what we were saying earlier. It goes back to the teachings that I read in the first segment.
Yeah.
You're not going to grow through a life of ease. You're not going to grow through a life of simplicity, and you're not going to grow that way.
Comfort.
If you take a look at the story of Abraham, Abraham lived his entire life under his parents' protection. Lived his entire life he had everything that he could ever possibly want. He didn't have to do anything. He had servants, he had everything. He was living what the world would say is the good life.
Right.
And then God called upon him to leave his father and mother's home and go out into the world. And then as we read through the Abraham story, he goes out into the world and he experiences incredible brutality. He experiences betrayal. He experiences hardships. I mean, but this also then becomes the life that he has given us generations later, that we can look at the trials and the tribulations and the adventures and the hardships and the joys and the sadness.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about a fully lived life. I think part of what we struggle with, we do not know the stories we will be asked to tell when we get to heaven. Because every one of us is going to have a story to tell.
I think we're going to wear the scars of our lives as badges of honor.
Father Chad Ripperger spoke about what you're talking about when in the context of battling the devil because of our sinfulness and whatnot. Mm-hmm. One of the things that he had talked about is how God will allow the temptations, the trials into our lives, specifically the ones that are attacking me, the ones that are attacking you. He allows that because when we take a look at virtue and vice, he will allow us to be attacked by that which he has prepared us to conquer. And so that through the conquering, okay, so we've talked about this in the past, we've shared with the audience that the temptations that I wrestle with are those of lust, and the temptations that you wrestle with are those of avarice or anger. Mm-hmm. We've shared that with the audience. And so by reaching for grace and by receiving grace to combat those temptations, when we are triumphant in those battles, it creates two things. Number one, it increases our merit and it increases our virtue. And at the same time, it also increases the humiliation of the enemy. Yeah. And so Father Chad, he kind of talks about how we get to heaven and we will receive a crown of glory for the life that we have lived that will clearly depict the demons that we've defeated in this world. Yeah. And so when we look at all of this, we look at the sufferings that we endure and how we reach out for virtue and we reach out for grace and we reach out for the strength that comes from the Holy Spirit. We look to the saints, the communion of saints, and those who have dealt with the same vices and the same demons that we're dealing with. We look to the communion of saints and the sufferings and the hardships. St. Francis of Assisi, he dealt with lust. We have stories of St. Francis. He'll spend time with St. Clare, and he would be moved through temptation of lust, and he'd strip his garments off and jump into rose bushes to create a physical distraction so that he could combat that issue. And so all of the sufferings that we encounter, it's an opportunity for two things. Number one, we could increase our virtue and gain merit by recognizing that we can't do this alone anyway. Mm-hmm. And we reach for grace and we reach for strength to increase our virtue. And the second thing is we have to understand that we're living in this temporary world. And so the attitudes that we have towards our suffering should be directed towards eternity. And we should allow ourselves to build the kingdom up and delay personal gratification, temporary gratification, so we can build up the kingdom of God.
Deacon, I often think about this, that the reason mankind was created and the reason that we're here in this time period that exists outside of God's time, I believe that we will be celestial witnesses to the mercy and trustworthiness of God. The same way,
absolutely.
The same way that the seraphim burn with the love of God and the cherubim with the knowledge of God, we will represent God's trustworthiness.
What you're speaking about is eschatology. It's truthful in the teachings of eschatology, the last things. The church clearly teaches in what's, we talk about particular judgment, which is when I die, I will be judged immediately. Mm-hmm. But then there's the general judgment, which happens at the second coming of Christ, and we have no idea when that's going to be. But at the second judgment, it's exactly what you're talking about. At the second coming of Christ, the general judgment, that's when the graves are all opened, mm-hmm. and that's when all of the witnesses of God's glory and God's condemnation will be made manifest for everyone to see. Those who have suffered will absolutely stand as witnesses to the glory of God. Those who have suffered well, those who have joined their sufferings to the redemptive suffering of Christ, as opposed to those who have cursed God and have demanded satisfaction in this life and have not lived a life worthy of eternal peace. That condemnation will also be made manifest, and it will be a public reckoning, which is known as the general judgment. And so, no, you're absolutely right. And this is why, and we can wrap it up with this, this is why it's important for us to understand, whenever we suffer, pause for the moment and think about your eternal destiny. And while, listen, I'll just be truthful, while what you're going through may be hard, and what you're going through hurts, and what you're going through seems unfair, it's only temporary. It's only temporary because one of the beautiful things of our mortality is no matter how bad things get, it's only temporary. And if we enter into it with the right attitude, it'll bring us to eternal joy.
Deacon, we're going to leave it there, but I just got to say, at the beginning of the show, I opened it up by saying that some shows are kind of you and an extended homily, and other times we have guests. This one was one of those shows where it was a little bit of spiritual guidance to me, and it was one of those homily type shows. This was an amazing show. You spoke to my heart once again.
Well, thank you, brother. I love you to death.
Same here, brother.
I love you for all eternity, and we're going to walk this walk together.
Absolutely,
through the fire to the other side.
Yeah. Don't forget to check out Deacon Don Prendergast on Facebook at Through the Fire. You want to check him out on YouTube, you go to Through the Fire with Deacon Don Prendergast, Rumble at Deacon Don, and you can always check both of us out at www.castingthe.net. Go there and check out the Through the Fire page, and please leave a question that you'd like for us to answer. So
yes, and also, Dave, if I can jump in here.
Yep.
Whatever radio station you're hearing this show on, let the radio station know what you think. Send an email and share the program with other people.
So for Deacon Don Prendergast, I'm David Fortin. Looking forward to seeing you next week.
The preceding program was a Spirit of Truth Radio Arts original program for CastingThe.net.